Most people assume that thinking clearly is the default state of a reasonably intelligent mind. We may admit that people become emotional, impulsive, or misled now and then, but underneath that, there is often a quiet confidence that sensible people generally see things more or less as they are. The Art of Thinking Clearly by Rolf Dobelli challenges that assumption with remarkable force. It suggests that poor thinking is not an occasional accident. It is a routine feature of ordinary mental life. This is what gives the book its power. It does not focus on a few spectacular mistakes made by obviously irrational people. Instead, it shows how normal, everyday judgment is shaped by recurring mental errors. These errors influence how we read the news, invest money, choose careers, evaluate success, interpret failure, trust stories, follow groups, and imagine the future. And because they are recurring, they are dangerous. They feel familiar, natural, and often invisible. Dobelli's book is not built as one long theory. It is a collection of short chapters, each devoted to a bias, fallacy, or cognitive trap. At first glance, that may sound fragmented. But the effect is cumulative. With each chapter, a larger picture emerges. Human beings are not merely uninformed. They are systematically misled by the structure of their own thinking. The book belongs to a tradition shaped by psychology and behavioral economics, but its tone is more practical than academic. Dobelli is not trying to turn readers into scientists. He is trying to make them harder to fool. More specifically, he is trying to make them harder to fool themselves. As we move through this summary, we will explore the book's central themes: cognitive bias, narrative distortion, social influence, overconfidence, loss aversion, misunderstanding of randomness, and the constant human tendency to confuse confidence with truth. The deeper lesson of the book is not that people are hopeless thinkers. It is that better judgment begins when we stop assuming our first impression is good enough. One of the most distinctive features of The Art of Thinking Clearly is its structure. Rather than developing a single grand argument chapter by chapter, Dobelli presents a series of compact essays, each focused on one cognitive error. This matters because it reflects the nature of the subject itself. Human irrationality is not one flaw repeated in different costumes. It is a network of recurring distortions, each with its own shape, emotional logic, and practical consequences. The book therefore works like a field manual. It teaches the reader to recognize patterns. One chapter may explore confirmation bias, another survivorship bias, another overconfidence, another social proof, another the sunk cost fallacy. Read one at a time. These chapters feel like individual cautions. Read together, they reveal a much more unsettling truth. The mind has favorite ways of being wrong. This catalog approach also makes the book highly practical. Readers do not need to master an abstract framework before applying the lessons. They can carry the concepts into daily life immediately. A headline starts to look different. A financial success story starts to feel incomplete. A charismatic leader becomes easier to evaluate with some distance. A personal decision begins to reveal the influence of pride, fear, or sunk costs. At the same time, the structure has a deeper philosophical implication. It suggests that clear thinking is not about finding one perfect worldview. It is about building a habit of correction. We do not become wiser by replacing one illusion with a final, flawless theory. We become wiser by repeatedly identifying where thought has gone astray. This is one reason the book remains so useful. It does not rely on a single insight. It offers a toolkit for intellectual self-defense. And beneath all its variety lies a unifying message. Thinking clearly is less about brilliance than about disciplined skepticism toward the mind's automatic habits. A major theme in Dobelli's book is that people are deeply vulnerable to stories. Human beings are not naturally statistical thinkers. They are narrative thinkers. When events happen, we want causes, characters, motives, and meaning. We want to know why something happened and what lesson it reveals. Stories satisfy this desire because they turn complexity into coherence. The problem is that coherence is not the same as truth. Real life is often shaped by chance, hidden variables, incomplete information, and systems too complicated for neat explanation. Yet the mind prefers a clean narrative to an honest admission of uncertainty. A company succeeds, and we tell a story about visionary leadership. An investor gets rich, and we tell a story about discipline and insight. A public figure rises, and we tell a story about charisma and destiny. Sometimes those stories contain genuine insight, but often they are oversimplified reconstructions of events shaped partly by luck and partly by selective memory. Dobelli repeatedly warns against mistaking plausibility for proof. A persuasive story can feel so satisfying that we stop asking what evidence is missing. This is especially dangerous because stories are emotionally sticky. Numbers and probabilities may be more accurate, but stories feel more human, more memorable, and more meaningful. The same pattern appears in personal life. We tell ourselves stories about why relationships fail, why projects succeed, why opportunities disappear, and why other people behave as they do. These stories can help us orient ourselves, but they can also lock us into false interpretations. Once a narrative takes hold, contradictory evidence becomes easier to ignore. This is one of the book's most valuable lessons. Clear thinking requires learning to resist the seduction of neat explanation. It requires asking whether the story is supported by evidence, whether alternative explanations exist, and whether randomness might be playing a larger role than the mind wants to admit. The mind loves stories because stories create order. But clear thinking begins when we remember that reality is often messier than the story that first comes to mind. Dobelli places great emphasis on the human failure to understand randomness. This is one of the most important themes in the book because it shapes how people interpret success, failure, talent, and risk. We naturally want outcomes to reveal deep truths. If someone succeeds, we want to know what they did right. If someone fails, we want to know what they did wrong. That desire is understandable, but it often leads us to overread results. Many outcomes in life are influenced not just by skill, but by luck. Markets fluctuate. Timing matters. Unseen conditions help or hinder. A strong effort can fail because of bad fortune, and a weak effort can succeed because of favorable circumstances. Yet once the outcome is visible, people rush to create a lesson. This is why survivorship bias is so powerful. We notice the winners because they are visible, and then we study them as if their path contains the full secret of success. But the invisible failures may have done many of the same things. Their stories are simply missing from view. The result is a distorted picture in which success appears more controllable and predictable than it really is. Dobelli wants the reader to become more cautious about lessons drawn from extremes. The best-selling founder, the spectacular investor, the famous artist, the extraordinary case study, all of these are tempting sources of wisdom. But if luck played a larger role than we admit, then copying the visible strategy may not reproduce the visible result. This insight is not meant to produce passivity. It is meant to produce realism. Clear thinking requires distinguishing skill from luck, process from outcome, and visible success from representative evidence. Without that distinction, we admire too easily, condemn too quickly, and learn the wrong things from the wrong examples. One of the book's deeper challenges, then, is humility. The world is less narratively tidy and less personally controllable than we often imagine. To think clearly is to remember that chance is not the exception to life. It is one of its permanent conditions. Among the many biases Dobelli discusses, confirmation bias is one of the most pervasive. Once people form a belief, they naturally begin seeking information that supports it and filtering out information that challenges it. This happens in politics, business, relationships, personal identity, and everyday opinion. The mind does not merely want truth. It wants consistency with what it already believes. This tendency is powerful because it rarely feels dishonest. People do not usually experience themselves as selecting evidence unfairly. They experience themselves as noticing what is relevant. But relevance is often shaped by prior commitment. Supporting evidence feels insightful. Contradictory evidence feels exceptional, flawed, or less trustworthy. Dobelli's insight here is deeply practical. Many people assume that gathering more information automatically improves judgment. But if the information gathering process is biased from the start, then more information may simply produce more confidence in a false view. The person does not become more accurate. They become more entrenched. This has serious consequences. Investors become attached to bad theses. Leaders ignore warning signs. Individuals remain trapped in inaccurate self-concepts. Entire groups harden into echo chambers, each one convinced that the facts are clearly on its side. The book encourages an uncomfortable but necessary habit, actively searching for disconfirming evidence. Not just asking whether your view can be supported, but asking what would prove it wrong. That is a harder question because it threatens the pleasure of certainty. Confirmation bias reveals that clear thinking is not just an intellectual exercise. It is a character challenge. It requires the willingness to be corrected, the patience to hold uncertainty, and the discipline to value accuracy more than the emotional comfort of being right. Dobelli also shows how deeply social thinking is. Human beings like to imagine themselves as independent decision-makers, but much of judgment is shaped by the behavior of others. Social proof is one of the clearest examples. When many people believe something, buy something, fear something, or praise something, it begins to feel more credible. In uncertain situations, this tendency can be adaptive. The crowd may genuinely know something useful, but it can also lead to powerful collective mistakes. Entire groups may adopt false beliefs, overvalue trends, or remain silent in the face of problems simply because each person reads everyone else as evidence. This is part of why bubbles form, fashion spread, reputations inflate, and panic travels so quickly. The crowd is not just influencing behavior externally. It is shaping perception internally. The individual begins to feel that what everyone else is doing must make sense. Group pressure becomes even more powerful because nonconformity carries emotional cost. To question a popular belief is not only an intellectual act, it is a social risk. People fear looking foolish, difficult, disloyal, or out of step. So they often follow along even when private doubts exist. Dobelli's warning is simple but important. Popularity is not proof. Agreement is not accuracy. Visibility is not validity. Clear thinking requires enough independence to step back from social momentum and ask whether the crowd's confidence is actually supported by evidence. This is one of the book's more challenging lessons because social belonging matters deeply to human beings. But if clarity depends entirely on consensus, then independent judgment becomes fragile. Sometimes the cost of thinking clearly is the willingness to stand apart before others catch up, or perhaps even when they never do. A recurring feature of human error in Dobelli's account is overconfidence. People routinely overestimate what they know, how accurately they can predict outcomes, and how much control they have over complex situations. This is not confined to amateurs. In many cases, expertise increases confidence faster than it increases actual reliability. The illusion of control is especially important. Human beings are uncomfortable with uncertainty, so they prefer to feel that effort, planning, and intelligence can dominate events. Sometimes they can. But often the world is too noisy, complex, and contingent for that level of mastery. Yet, because people act, choose, and strategize, they easily conclude that outcomes are more under their control than they truly are. This illusion shows up everywhere. Investors believe they can outsmart volatile markets. Managers believe they can engineer outcomes beyond their reach. Individuals believe careful planning can eliminate risk. When success occurs, confidence expands. When failure occurs, People often explain it away without fully revising their sense of mastery. Dobelli's treatment of overconfidence is useful because it does not attack ambition itself. It attacks unwarranted certainty. Clear thinking does not mean surrendering effort. It means calibrating confidence to reality. It means understanding that uncertainty does not disappear just because we dislike it. This lesson matters especially in forecasting. People make plans with extraordinary conviction despite repeated evidence that their predictions are too optimistic, too narrow, or too neat. The mind builds futures it wants to believe in. And once those imagined futures feel vivid, doubt becomes harder to maintain. The practical response is humility supported by process. Use reference points. Compare your case to similar cases. Expect friction. Treat confidence as a feeling, not proof. In many domains, the person who seems most certain is not the one who sees most clearly. Often, clarity sounds more modest than conviction. Closely related to overconfidence is the planning fallacy, the tendency to underestimate how long things will take, how difficult they will be, and how many obstacles will appear along the way. Dobelli shows that people repeatedly create unrealistic plans because they focus on the internal logic of the task rather than on the historical pattern of similar tasks. When imagining the future, the mind tends to construct a clean sequence. First this happens, then that happens, then the result is achieved. Interruptions, delays, mistakes, fatigue, competing priorities, and bad luck are either minimized or omitted. The plan feels sensible because its narrative is smooth. The problem is that reality is rarely smooth. Projects run over time. Costs expand. Motivation fluctuates. Unexpected difficulties emerge. Yet people continue to plan as though this time the future will behave more neatly than the past suggests. This matters not only for business and large undertakings, but for daily life. Calendars get overloaded. Personal goals become unrealistic. Pressure increases because the original schedule was never grounded in a serious view of real constraints. Dobelli's practical guidance here is simple but effective. Use the outside view. Instead of asking only what your plan requires in theory, ask what similar efforts have actually required in practice. The best antidote to planning fantasy is not more enthusiasm. It is better reference data. This chapter of the book is especially valuable because it shows that bad planning is often not a moral failing. It is a cognitive one. People are not always lazy or irresponsible when their plans collapse. Very often, they were imagining a future that never had much chance of existing in the first place. Clear thinking means respecting how often the world refuses to follow the elegant script written in our heads. Few ideas in the book are as practically important as loss aversion and sunk costs. Dobelli explains that people feel losses more strongly than equivalent gains. Losing something hurts more than gaining the same thing feels good. This asymmetry shapes decisions constantly, often without people realizing it. Because losses feel so powerful, individuals cling to things they should release. They hold bad investments, keep pursuing failed strategies, stay in draining commitments, and resist necessary change. The emotional logic is clear. Giving something up makes the loss feel real. Continuing, even irrationally, preserves the hope that the loss can still be undone. The sunk cost fallacy intensifies this pattern. Once time, money, effort, or identity has been invested in something, people feel pressure to keep going because abandoning it would mean accepting that the earlier investment cannot be recovered. But from a rational perspective, sunk costs should not determine present choices. What matters is the future value of continuing versus stopping. Dobelli is unsentimental here, and that is part of the book's value. He reminds the reader that the past is gone whether or not we admit it. Continuing a bad path does not rescue the cost already paid. It often increases the damage. This lesson applies broadly. Businesses stay with failing products. Individuals remain in empty relationships. Institutions protect outdated systems. Professionals persist in careers they no longer believe in. In each case, Attachment to prior investment distorts present judgment. The practical antidote is to ask a brutally clear question. If I had not already invested in this, would I choose it now? That question strips away the emotional weight of history and refocuses attention on present and future value. Loss aversion and sunk costs are powerful because they reveal how often people do not merely choose what is best. They choose what hurts least emotionally in the short term. Clear thinking sometimes requires accepting a painful truth quickly in order to avoid a much larger cost later. Another sharp and practical theme in The Art of Thinking Clearly is Dobelli's skepticism about news and information overload. Modern people often assume that being informed means consuming a constant stream of updates, headlines, alerts, and commentary. But Dobelli argues that much of what passes for being informed is actually exposure to noise. News naturally favors the dramatic, recent, emotional, and unusual. These features make information attention-grabbing, but they do not necessarily make it meaningful. A highly visible event may have little long-term significance, while slow-moving structural realities may matter enormously and receive little attention. This distorts judgment because the mind treats vivid information as important. If something is heavily reported, it feels central. If it is urgent in tone, it feels consequential. Yet, frequency of exposure is not a reliable measure of value. Dobelli's critique is not simply anti-media. It is about cognitive hygiene. Clear thinking depends partly on what we allow into our minds. If our attention is constantly hijacked by fragmentary, emotionally charged, low-signal information, our perception of reality becomes warped. We start living in the rhythm of interruption rather than reflection. The broader lesson is that more information is not the same as more understanding. Sometimes clarity improves not through addition, but subtraction. Better thinking may require reducing exposure to noise, choosing slower and more reliable sources, and preserving the mental space needed for deeper reasoning. This is one of the book's most modern insights. In a world where information is abundant, discernment becomes more valuable than access. Clear thinking is not only about how we interpret facts. It is also about which facts we permit to dominate our attention in the first place. Dobelli repeatedly encourages readers to look beneath surface explanations and ask about incentives. This is one of the book's most useful habits of thought. People often interpret behavior in terms of personality, principle, or stated intention while overlooking the rewards and penalties shaping action behind the scenes. Incentives matter because human beings respond to structures, not just ideals. Organizations promote what they measure. Professionals defend what benefits them. Media amplify what gains attention. Individuals frame advice in ways that align with their interests, sometimes consciously and sometimes not. Ignoring incentives leads to naive judgment. A reader may assume that an expert recommendation is purely objective when financial motives are involved. An employee may misunderstand workplace behavior without seeing how institutional rewards are structured. A consumer may trust messaging without asking who benefits from the story being told. Dobelli does not reduce everything to cynicism. Not every action is selfish in a crude sense. But he insists that clear thinking begins by recognizing that incentives are often more powerful than stated values. What people are rewarded for often predicts behavior better than what they say they believe. This principle sharpens judgment because it moves thought from surface interpretation to deeper structure. Instead of asking only what is being claimed, we begin asking why this claim is being made, what rewards are attached, and what unseen interests may be guiding behavior. The lesson is deeply practical. In business, politics, media, and everyday advice, appearances are often incomplete. Clear thinking requires the habit of asking what pressures, benefits, and incentives sit quietly behind what is visible. After moving through so many cognitive traps, a natural question arises: what should we do with all this? Dobelli does not pretend that awareness eliminates bias. Knowing the names of mental errors does not automatically protect us from them. The mind remains quick, emotional, social, and story-driven. But awareness does matter because it creates friction. It slows automatic judgment enough for reflection to enter. And over time, better thinking becomes less about achieving perfect rationality and more about building better process. That process includes several habits. Be cautious with first impressions. Separate outcome from decision quality. Use outside views and reference classes. Actively look for disconfirming evidence. Ask what role luck may have played. Watch for social pressure. Notice when loss aversion is driving attachment. Reduce noise. Examine incentives. And most importantly, calibrate certainty downward. Humility sits at the center of all of this. Not humility as passivity, but humility as accurate self-assessment. The clear thinker is not the one who never errs. It is the one who assumes error is possible, often likely, and therefore designs thinking accordingly. This is one reason the book is more than a list of biases. It is a lesson in intellectual posture. It teaches restraint. It teaches skepticism toward the emotionally satisfying answer. It teaches the value of pause. In a culture that often rewards speed, certainty, and confidence, these habits can feel unnatural. But Dobelli's deeper message is that better judgment does not usually come from thinking faster or more forcefully. It comes from seeing where thought is likely to go wrong and adjusting before the damage is done. The art of thinking clearly endures because it offers a simple but demanding promise. It cannot make you perfectly rational, but it can make you harder to fool. Harder to fool by headlines, by crowds, by success stories, by urgency, by sunk costs, by overconfidence, by flattering narratives, and perhaps most importantly, by your own mind. Rolf Dobelli's real achievement is not merely naming biases. It is showing how ordinary they are. Poor thinking is not a rare malfunction. It is built into normal judgment. That is precisely why awareness matters. Once we see the patterns, we can begin to interrupt them. The book leaves the reader with a more sober but more useful image of thought. The mind is clever, but not naturally clear. It is quick, but not naturally accurate. It wants coherence, reassurance, belonging, and emotional comfort. Reality does not always provide those things. Clear thinking, then, is not an automatic gift. It is a discipline. It is the habit of questioning what feels obvious, of resisting the pull of story over evidence, of remembering luck, of respecting uncertainty, and of choosing better processes over confident impulses. In the end, this is what the book teaches best. Wisdom is not only about knowing more. Very often, it is about making fewer avoidable mistakes. And that begins with the courage to admit that the first person most likely to mislead you is often yourself.